The day my daughter handed me that piece of paper across the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with homework for 12 years, where we'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts together, I didn't say a word. I just looked at her. And then I looked at him, her husband, standing behind her with his arms crossed like he was negotiating a business deal, which I suppose is exactly what he thought this was. I smiled, not because I was happy, not because any part of what was happening felt remotely okay. I smiled because I had been waiting for this moment for 8 months, and everything I needed was already sitting in my lawyer's briefcase, 3 miles away, ready to go. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Martin, and I spent 41 years building a landscaping company from nothing. I mean nothing. A used truck, 2 broken mowers, and a list of neighbors who felt sorry enough for me to let me cut their grass for $30. My wife, Ellen, kept our books in a spiral notebook for the first 3 years because we couldn't afford accounting software. She worked part-time at the school district and came home to enter receipts by hand at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. We didn't take a real vacation until our 15th anniversary. We drove to Asheville for 4 days and considered it the height of luxury. By the time Ellen got sick, Greenbrook Landscaping had 14 full-time employees, 3 commercial contracts with the county, and a reputation that had taken 4 decades to build. We owned our house outright. We had retirement accounts, a small rental property on the east side of town, and a life insurance policy that I'd paid into for 27 years without ever touching. I say all this not to brag. I say it because you need to understand what was at stake. And you need to understand that neither of my children built a single bit of it. Ellen passed in February. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was gone before I'd even figured out how to tell people. She was 63 years old and the most capable person I have ever known. And then one Tuesday morning she wasn't there anymore, and the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum from the bedroom. My daughter, Sasha, called that evening. She cried. We cried together. She said she was coming down from Charlotte the following weekend, and we'd figure everything out together. That was the phrase she used, figure everything out together. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought she meant grief. I thought she meant arrangements. I thought she meant the kind of together that families do when they lose someone. I was wrong about what she meant by everything. She arrived on a Saturday with her husband, Troy. No, wait. That name's been used. His name was Fletcher. She arrived with Fletcher, and he wore a collared shirt tucked in, which he never did, and they brought a casserole dish from some restaurant that cost $20 and tasted like nothing. I remember that casserole. I remember thinking it was strange that she hadn't cooked it herself the way she used to when she came to visit, back when she still came to visit without an agenda. We sat in the living room that evening, and Fletcher put his hands on his knees and said he wanted to talk about the estate situation. His words. The estate situation. Ellen had been in the ground for 11 days. I told him I wasn't ready to have that conversation. He said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, he said, Martin, with all due respect, these things don't wait. There are tax implications. Sasha didn't say anything. She looked at her hands. I told them both I was going to bed, and they were welcome to stay in the guest room. In the morning, they were still there. Fletcher was on his laptop at my kitchen table. Sasha was making coffee like she owned the place, and maybe that was exactly what she was starting to think. My son, Davis, drove up from Savannah that Sunday. Davis is younger by 4 years, and he and Sasha have never been close, not since they were teenagers, and I couldn't tell exactly why. He's quiet where she's loud. He thinks before he speaks, which is something I've always admired and probably didn't say enough. He hugged me at the door for a long time without saying anything, and that meant more to me than anything Fletcher had said in 2 days. But even Davis, standing in my kitchen that Sunday afternoon, looked at the house differently than he used to. I noticed it. The way his eyes went to the built-in bookshelves I'd put in 20 years ago, the crown molding I'd added myself, the back porch addition we'd built the summer Sasha graduated high school. He looked at all of it like he was taking inventory. I told myself I was imagining it. I wasn't. The formal meeting, because that's what it became, a formal meeting in my own home, happened the 3rd week of March. Sasha had driven back up again, this time with a printed agenda. An actual printed agenda with bullet points. Fletcher brought a legal pad. I sat across from them at the dining room table, the one Ellen had found at an estate sale in 1998, the one we'd refinished together in the garage, over a long weekend while the kids were at their grandparents'. I thought about that weekend while Fletcher was talking. I thought about Ellen with sandpaper on her hands and sawdust in her hair, laughing at something I'd said that I couldn't even remember anymore. Davis sat at the far end of the table. He hadn't been invited. Sasha had not called him about this particular meeting, but I had. Fletcher opened his legal pad. He looked at me with the expression of a man who is trying to look sympathetic, while actually feeling nothing of the sort, and said, "So what we think makes the most sense, going forward, is a clean transfer. The house goes into a family trust. We take over management of the rental property, since we have more bandwidth for that kind of thing right now. And the business, since you're going to be retiring soon anyway, should probably be transitioned to us to protect the asset." I looked at him. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the table. I said, "Is that right?" It was not a question. Fletcher said there were tax advantages to doing it sooner rather than later. He said something about stepped-up basis and estate planning thresholds. He'd clearly spent some time on Google. He said Sasha could run Greenbrook since she had her MBA. She did have an MBA, which was a degree I had paid for, and that he could handle the financial side of things since he had experience in operations. Fletcher worked in middle management at a medical supply distribution company. He had never once, in 12 years of marriage to my daughter, shown the smallest interest in Greenbrook. Not once. He had come to the company Christmas party twice in those 12 years. He had never asked me how we got our county contracts. He had never asked me anything about the business at all, except once, at Thanksgiving about 4 years ago, when he'd asked what I figured it was worth. I should have known then. I said, "I appreciate you both thinking this through." I said it calmly. I stood up, went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and came back. I said, "I'm not ready to make any decisions right now, but I'll be in touch." Fletcher's jaw tightened. Sasha finally looked up. She said, "Dad, we're just trying to help." I said, "I know. What I did not say is that I'd already met with my attorney, a man named Gregory Whitfield. No, let me use a different name. A man named Paul Eckhart, who had handled Ellen's and my legal affairs for 22 years. I had met with Paul the second week of February, 10 days after Ellen passed, not because I was ready to deal with the estate, but because something had shifted in the way my daughter looked at my house, and I'd learned, 41 years in business, to trust that feeling. Paul had asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted to be fair. I told him I wanted my kids taken care of, but I also told him I didn't want to spend the last chapter of my life being managed by my son-in-law. Paul had nodded slowly. He'd known Ellen. He'd come to the memorial service. He said, "Martin, let me ask you something. How much do you know about Fletcher's financial situation?" I said I didn't know much. He said I might want to find out. I had gone home that night and spent 4 hours going through things I should have paid more attention to. Credit card statements that Sasha had left at the house over the years when they'd visited. A conversation I'd half-heard between her and Ellen in the kitchen 3 years ago. Something about refinancing. Something about Fletcher's job. Something that Ellen had later described to me only as Sasha having a hard time right now. I thought about the way Sasha had stopped asking about Davis and started asking about the business. I thought about how, last Christmas, Fletcher had very casually asked whether I'd ever considered a buyout scenario. I'd laughed it off at the time. I wasn't laughing now. I started asking around quietly, my accountant, one of my commercial clients who knew people. What I learned was not shocking exactly, but it was clarifying. Fletcher had taken out a second mortgage on their house in Charlotte without telling Sasha until after the fact, according to someone who knew them. He had some kind of investment that had gone sideways. The details were fuzzy, but the picture was not. Fletcher was not coming to my kitchen table because he cared about the future of Greenbrook landscaping. Fletcher was coming because he needed money, and he had decided that the fastest path to it was through me. And my daughter who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, who called me every Sunday until she was about 32, who cried at her mother's funeral until she could barely stand. My daughter had let him lead. That was the thing I kept coming back to, in the months between February and the day they handed me that piece of paper. Not the greed, exactly. Greed I understood. People get scared. People get desperate. What I couldn't get past was the silence. Sasha sitting across from me with her hands in her lap, while her husband carved up everything her mother and I had built, and not saying a single word to stop it. Not once. Davis was different. Davis had pulled me aside after that March meeting, out on the back porch, and he'd said, "Dad, what do you need from me?" Just that. Not what do I get, not what's the plan, what do you need? I'd told him I needed time. He said okay, and he'd driven back to Savannah, and he'd called me every Tuesday night since. The piece of paper came in October. I had expected something dramatic. A confrontation, maybe, or a formal letter from a lawyer. What I got was Sasha sitting across from me at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon while Fletcher stood behind her with his arms crossed, and she slid a document across the table. It was a proposal. That's what they were calling it. A proposal. It outlined a full transfer of Greenbrook Landscaping to a new LLC controlled by Fletcher and Sasha. It proposed that I receive a monthly stipend, their word, stipend, like I was an intern, drawn from the company's profits. The house would go into a family trust with Sasha as the managing trustee. The rental property would be sold, proceeds split, with the larger share going to operational costs of the transition. Davis got nothing in this proposal. His name appeared once, in a footnote, as other surviving heir, whose interests will be addressed in a subsequent agreement. A footnote. I read the whole thing. I read it slowly, all 7 pages. Sasha watched me read. Fletcher had moved to the window and was looking out at the backyard, with the expression of a man who considers the negotiation already won. When I finished, I set it down on the table. I said, "I need to make a phone call." Fletcher said, "Martin, we really should." I said, "I need to make a phone call." I went into Ellen's old sewing room, which is where I go when I need a minute, and I called Paul Eckart's office. His assistant picked up. I told her I needed Paul at my house the following Monday, and that he should bring the revised documents we'd been working on. She said she'd let him know. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down. I looked at my daughter. I said, "Okay, let's do Monday. We'll get the attorneys involved and make it official." Sasha looked relieved. Fletcher actually smiled. He said, "That's the right call, Martin. I know this isn't easy, but this is going to be better for everyone." I did not say what I was thinking. Monday came. Paul Eckert arrived at 9 in the morning in a jacket and tie. He'd been doing estate law for 35 years, and he had the manner of a man who has seen every variation of family dysfunction and is no longer surprised by any of it. He shook my hand. He shook Davis's hand. Davis had driven up from Savannah on Sunday, and this time Sasha had not been informed in advance. When Sasha and Fletcher walked into the dining room and saw Davis sitting there, Sasha stopped in the doorway. She looked at me. I said, "Davis's family. He should be here." Fletcher sat down. He set up his own notepad. He looked at Paul and said, "So, I think Martin has had a chance to review our proposal. We're hoping to get the transfer documents signed today if we can." Paul said, "Well, before we get to that, there are a few things we need to go over." He opened his briefcase. He set a document on the table, face down, and said, "Do you want to walk them through it, or should I?" I said, "Go ahead, Paul." Paul turned the document over. He said, "This is the revised and finalized last will and testament of Ellen Ruth Calloway, executed in her presence, and witnessed appropriately in January of this year, approximately 3 weeks before her passing. Martin came to me in December, when Ellen's prognosis had become clearer, and we worked with her on some specific language. Fletcher said, 'We've seen the will, the assets.' Paul said, 'This is the revised will, not the 2019 version your family received a copy of, this one.'" The room went quiet. Ellen had known. That was the thing I hadn't been ready to tell anyone. Ellen had known, by December, what was happening with Fletcher and Sasha. She hadn't said much to me directly. That wasn't her way. But she had asked me one afternoon, when she was having a better day, sitting up in bed with the winter light coming through the curtains. She had asked me if I thought Sasha was going to be okay. Not financially. She'd been very specific. She'd said, "I don't mean money. I mean, is she going to be okay?" And I hadn't known what to say, and Ellen had looked at her hands and said, "I want to make sure the business stays what it is, what we made it." I'd called Paul the next morning. The revised will was specific. Greenbrook Landscaping was to remain in trust, managed by a board consisting of myself and 2 named independent advisors, both longtime colleagues I trusted, for a minimum of 5 years, after which it could be considered for transfer to any heir who had actively participated in its operations for at least 3 of those 5 years. The house remained in my possession for my lifetime, with ownership passing to Davis and Sasha equally upon my death, with no provisions for spouses of heirs. The rental property had already been transferred into a separate trust in Davis's name the previous month. The stipend was for me, drawn from the company I'd built. $5,000 a month, guaranteed, regardless of what the business earned or who tried to redirect it. That had been Ellen's specific request. Make sure he doesn't have to ask anyone for anything, she'd told Paul. Ever. Paul read the key provisions out loud. He did it quietly, without drama, the way a man reads a document that speaks for itself. Sasha had gone very still. Fletcher's notepad was closed. At some point, his pen had rolled off the table, and he hadn't picked it up. When Paul finished, Fletcher said, "This can be contested." Paul said, "You're welcome to pursue that." Ellen was of sound mind. The document was witnessed by 2 independent parties and a notary, and Martin has documentation of her competency evaluation from her physician in December. You could contest it. I'd be happy to provide you with the timeline of what that process looks like. Fletcher said nothing. I looked at Sasha. She was looking at the table. The same way she'd looked at the table in March, when Fletcher had done the talking. For a moment she looked exactly like the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, and I felt something pull in my chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, just grief. Just grief for the version of my daughter I missed, the one who called on Sundays, the one who hadn't yet decided that her father's life's work was a resource to be extracted. I said, "Sasha." She looked up. I said, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I want you to hear that." She didn't say anything. I said, "Your mother built this with me. Every contract, every piece of equipment, every employee. Your mother had a hand in it, and she wanted it protected. Not from you, but she wanted it protected." I paused. "If you want to be part of what this company becomes, that door is open. The will spells out exactly how. You could work there. You could learn it. But it doesn't get handed to anyone." Fletcher pushed back his chair. He said, "I think we need to talk to our own attorney before this goes any further." Paul said, "Of course." They left without the casserole dish this time. No pleasantries, no goodbye at the door. I heard Fletcher say something in the driveway, low and tight, and Sasha say nothing back. Davis and I stood at the kitchen window and watched them drive away. He said, "You okay, Dad?" I said I didn't know yet. He laughed a little, the way you do when the only other option is crying, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and we stood there until the car turned the corner. The weeks after that were complicated. Sasha didn't call. Fletcher had, in fact, consulted an attorney, and we received a letter in November that amounted to nothing, because Paul had been exactly right about the document's integrity. The letter stopped after Paul's response. Fletcher never followed up after that. In January, Sasha called. It was a Sunday. I almost didn't recognize the pattern. Sunday afternoon, the way it used to be. She called and I picked up, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." Just that. No explanation, no conditions, no Fletcher in the background. I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how I let it get that far." I said, "I think you were scared." She said yes. We talked for almost 2 hours. It was the longest we'd talked since her mother's diagnosis. At some point she told me that Fletcher had lost a significant amount of money in a private investment that had failed, and that she'd known about it later than she should have, and that for a long time she had been so frightened about their financial situation that she'd convinced herself that the only solution was what was right in front of her. My assets, my business, her inheritance, she'd started calling it in her own head, like it was already hers, like I was already gone. I understood that, more than she knew. Fear makes you into someone you didn't plan to be. I didn't tell her what I thought about Fletcher. That wasn't the conversation to have that day. What I did tell her was that the offer I'd made at that dining room table still stood. If she wanted to come work at Greenbrook, really work, starting from the ground level the way I had, the way her mother had, we could talk about it. It wouldn't be an easy arrangement, but it was an honest one. She said she'd think about it. She did more than think. The following March, she started coming down on alternating weekends, walking job sites with the crew foreman, learning the commercial bid process, asking questions. Fletcher did not come with her. I didn't ask about that, and she didn't offer. Some conversations have their own timeline. Davis called me one Tuesday night in April and said, "Is it weird that I'm glad things turned out this way?" I told him yes and no. He said, "I just mean, I'm glad you didn't give it all away." I said, "Your mother made sure of that." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "She always was the smartest one in the room." I told him she absolutely was, every single time. I still go into her sewing room sometimes when I need a minute. The light in there is the same. The window looks out onto the side yard, where she planted hydrangeas 20 years ago, And they still come back every summer the same as they always did, big and blue and stubborn in the heat. She would have hated the drama of these past months. She would have handled the whole thing with a lot less heartache than I did. But she also sat in that room in December, with an ivy in her arm and winter light on her face, and she told Paul exactly what she wanted to happen. She used clear language. She didn't leave anything to chance or to goodwill or to the assumption that people would do right by each other just because they were family. That was the most Ellen thing she ever did. I kept the business. I kept the house. I have my stipend and my hydrangeas and my Tuesday phone calls. And, slowly, carefully, I'm getting my daughter back. It turns out that's worth more than anything I could have signed over.